Let's delve deeper into the nature of fear, that ubiquitous emotion that can both warn us of real danger and imprison us in a cage of irrational anxieties. Each of us experiences fear. It's a fundamental bodily reaction, deeply rooted in our biology, designed to protect us from what we perceive as a threat. However, as rightly noted, what we fear is not always a real danger. Often, our minds play tricks on us, conjuring visions of threats that exist only in our imagination. The key question then becomes the ability to distinguish when our fear is justified and when it is merely a product of our psyche, having no reflection in objective reality. Our bodies are equipped with an incredibly complex and effective alarm system. As soon as we register something that our brain interprets as a potential threat, a series of physiological and psychological reactions immediately kicks in, commonly known as the fight or flight response. Our heart starts beating faster, our breathing becomes shallower and quicker, our muscles tense up, ready for action, and our mind focuses almost exclusively on one thing: survival. This mechanism, developed over thousands of years of evolution, played a crucial role in the survival of our ancestors, helping them avoid dangerous predators or react to hostile tribes. Thanks to this innate ability to quickly assess danger and react immediately, humanity was able to survive in a perilous environment. However, in today's complex world, this same system, which once protected us, sometimes begins to work against us, generating fear in situations that objectively do not pose a real threat. Imagine a situation where we are walking alone down a dark street late at night and suddenly hear footsteps behind us. Almost automatically, our breathing quickens, our heart begins to pound in our chest, and a feeling of unease, even fear, arises in our mind. Our body prepares for a potential confrontation or escape because, in a split second, our brain has classified this situation as potentially dangerous. However, let's think more deeply. What if those footsteps belong to someone who is simply walking in the same direction as us, perhaps returning home from work? What if that disturbing sound is just an echo of our own footsteps bouncing off the walls of buildings? At this particular moment, the crucial thing is to ask ourselves a fundamental question. Is our emotional and physiological reaction adequate to the real situation? Are we relying on objective facts, or merely on our assumptions and projections? Fear itself is not bad. It serves an important warning function, and thanks to it, we can avoid real dangers, such as hazardous physical situations or risky behaviors. The real problem arises when our mind begins to interpret neutral or harmless situations as dangerous, generating fear where objectively there is none. Let's consider for a moment how many times in our lives we have worried intensely about something, dedicating energy and time to it, only for it to never actually happen. How many times has our fear suggested catastrophic scenarios that in reality turned out to be completely wrong and had no reflection in reality? Such experiences show how powerful our imagination can be and how easily we can become prisoners of our own negative thoughts. Let's take another widely known example, the fear of flying, known as aviophobia. Imagine a person who is about to take a plane trip. Several days before the scheduled flight, they begin to feel increasing stress and anxiety. Intrusive, negative thoughts start appearing in their head. What if something terrible happens during the flight? What if the plane's engine fails and we crash? What if there is severe turbulence during the flight that leads to a catastrophe? At the moment the plane begins to take off, this person's heart beats wildly. Their palms begin to sweat, and their whole body is tense and ready for the worst. However, if we look at the facts and statistics, it turns out that flying is one of the safest modes of transport in the world. The probability of a plane accident is extremely low compared to other forms of travel. In this case, the fear of flying is rather an irrational anxiety, not based on objective data and real danger. And now, let's think about everyday situations in which our fear may be wrong and unnecessarily paralyze us. Perhaps you feel a strong fear of failure, and therefore avoid taking on new, potentially rewarding challenges in your professional or personal life. Maybe you avoid making new contacts and talking to other people because it seems to you that you will be judged or rejected. Or perhaps you are delaying making an important decision that could positively impact your life because you are afraid of making a mistake and suffering negative consequences. In such moments, when fear begins to dominate our actions, it is crucial to pause for a moment and ask ourselves a fundamental question. Do I have real evidence that what I fear will actually happen? Is my fear based on solid foundations, or is it just a product of my imagination? One of the most effective ways to distinguish real danger from the illusion created by our mind is conscious and critical analysis of our own thoughts. When a strong fear or anxiety arises in your head, try to break down this emotion into its component parts. Consider what specifically triggers this fear. Does what you fear really have a high chance of happening in objective reality? Are you basing your fear on concrete facts and evidence, or rather on vague assumptions, negative predictions, or emotional reactions? Often, it turns out that our fears are more related to our internal beliefs and interpretations of the situation than to a real threat. It is also often helpful to look at a given situation from a certain distance. Imagine that a close friend of yours is struggling with a similar problem and comes to you for advice. What would you tell them in such a situation? What arguments would you use to calm them down and help them look at the problem from a different perspective? In most cases, we can soberly and objectively assess the situations of others, offering them rational advice and support. However, when it comes to our own problems and fears, we often fall into the trap of irrational anxieties and negative thoughts, losing the ability to objectively assess the situation. Fear often turns out to be a very bad advisor in our lives. When we allow it to control our decisions and actions, we unknowingly give up many opportunities for growth, experiencing joy, and achieving personal happiness. Think about how many times in the past you didn't do something you really wanted to do, just because you were afraid of what other people would say. How many times did you give up a promising career or a personal opportunity because your mind conjured up dark scenarios and negative consequences? Remember a fundamental truth. What you think and feel is not always a reflection of objective truth. Our brains have a natural tendency to exaggerate potential threats and simultaneously underestimate our own ability to cope with difficulties and challenges. One of the most effective ways to deal with paralyzing fear is to take concrete action, even if it seems difficult and uncomfortable at first. For example, if you feel a strong fear of public speaking, you don't have to immediately stand in front of a large audience. Start with smaller steps, talk to one person, give a short message to a small group of friends. If you are afraid of traveling to unfamiliar places, try a short trip to nearby areas first. If you are worried that you won't be able to handle a new task or project, just try to start, focusing on the first smallest step. The truth is that most of our fears never materialize, and even if something doesn't go as we imagined, it usually turns out that we are much more resilient and resourceful than we thought, and we can cope with it. Think for a moment about how many things in your life have happened contrary to your earlier, fear-filled predictions. How many times did you think a situation would be a disaster, and it ultimately turned out to be completely fine, or even brought positive results? Our mind has a tendency to dramatize and create negative scenarios, but reality is rarely as terrible and hopeless as it initially seems to us. Of course, this does not mean that fear is always a negative emotion to be avoided at all costs. Sometimes our fear is completely justified, and in such situations, it is important to listen to it and take it seriously, for example, when it concerns a real threat to our health or life. The key skill is learning to distinguish between situations where fear serves a protective function and is helpful to us, and those where it only limits us, paralyzes us, and prevents us from living a full and satisfying life. If you want to start working on your fear, try a simple but effective method. Every time you feel increasing fear or anxiety, pause for a moment and ask yourself a crucial question. Is what I fear an objective fact, or just my subjective interpretation of the situation? Often, it will turn out that your fear is just an unconfirmed assumption, a negative prediction that has no solid basis in objective reality. And if that's the case, then it's not worth letting it rule your life and the decisions you make.